Autumn had settled heavily over the small, isolated town of Ravenshollow. The streets were lined with brittle leaves, and the wind carried with it the distinct chill that heralded the approach of Halloween. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about an ancient local legend, one that resurfaced every year as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The legend of the murderous Scarecrow. At the edge of town, beyond the sagging wooden fence, lay Old Miller's farm, a stretch of desolate land that hadn't produced a decent crop in over a decade. The farm itself was a ghost of what it had been, abandoned machinery rusting away, barn doors creaking in the wind, and an eerie quiet that settled like a curse over the fields. And standing tall in the center of it all was the Scarecrow. Ragged, ancient, with a gaping mouth stitched crudely onto its burlap face, it loomed like a sentinel in the middle of the dying cornfield. David Hargrove had heard the stories since he was a boy, how the Scarecrow was no ordinary farmhand's creation. Legend said that it had once belonged to a farmer whose family had been cursed for stealing land from a wandering stranger. Enraged, the stranger cast a spell on the Scarecrow, binding it to return to life every Halloween to hunt the living. Once the moon reached its zenith, the Scarecrow would awaken, selecting one unlucky soul to torment until dawn. David never believed a word of it. Yet this year was different. He had returned to Ravenshollow reluctantly, called back by the news of his father's death. His childhood home felt like a prison now, filled with memories that refused to be forgotten. The town, once a place of refuge, now seemed suffocating. But it was the strange occurrences that unnerved him the most. For weeks, David had noticed the oddest things: rustling in the empty cornfields, shadowy figures flickering at the edge of his vision, and, most disturbing of all, the sensation that he was being watched. It wasn't long before the Scarecrow itself became the center of his unease. One evening, just before Halloween, David took a walk along the edges of the farm. The fields, long since abandoned, were barren except for the lone figure of the Scarecrow. From afar it appeared still, but as David got closer, something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier around it, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic. He paused at the fence, his eyes narrowing. The Scarecrow's head, which had always hung low as if weighted by years of neglect, now seemed slightly tilted in his direction. He shook his head, blaming his nerves for the imagined movement. But as he turned to leave, he heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. It was unintelligible at first, like the muttering of a distant crowd. But it grew louder, more distinct, as if the very earth around him were coming alive with voices. David. He spun around, heart pounding. No one was there. The cornfield was empty, save for the Scarecrow. And yet the whisper persisted, now louder, closer. David. Fear gnawed at him, but pride kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't run. It was just a story, just a silly local legend meant to scare children. Yet the feeling that something ancient and malevolent was watching him crept over his skin like a cold shiver. As he turned to leave once more, a soft rustle echoed from behind him. He glanced back and his breath caught in his throat. The Scarecrow's head, once limp, was now fully upright, its hollow eyes staring directly at him. The stitched mouth? Had it always been so wide? The whispers returned, now a chorus, chanting his name in a slow, chilling rhythm. David ran. Night fell over Ravenshollow like a shroud, thick and oppressive, as the autumn moon began its slow crawl across the sky. The air, once crisp with the scent of dying leaves, now carried an inexplicable weight, an ancient wrong stirring in the darkness, waiting to claim its due. David's heart had not yet settled from his encounter at the farm. The Scarecrow's image was burned into his mind, a grotesque silhouette seeping into his thoughts like poison. He sat in his father's old study, nursing a glass of whiskey, hoping the burn of the liquid would dull his anxiety. The room was cluttered with relics of his father's life, dusty tomes lining the shelves, yellowed maps pinned to the walls, and the unmistakable air of disuse. But tonight, the house felt more alive than ever. Each creak of the floorboards, each sigh of the wind, taking on a sinister quality. His mind returned to the Scarecrow, to that stitched smile which seemed to mock the very fragility of his sanity. He tried to reason with himself, tried to dismiss the voices, the movement as the product of his own exhaustion and grief. But deep inside, buried beneath layers of skepticism, he felt it. An ancient dread, something primal and inescapable, clawing at his rationality. In the quiet of the room, the wind outside began to howl, fierce and relentless, rattling the windows. But there was something more, a scraping sound, faint but deliberate. David stiffened in his chair, eyes darting toward the window that overlooked the vast stretch of Miller's farm. His pulse quickened. A shadow passed by, a fleeting figure that seemed to blend with the night itself. He told himself it was just the wind moving the branches, just his imagination feeding on the darkness. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, a dragging, shuffling noise, as if something was being pulled through the brittle cornstalks. David rose, his glass forgotten on the table, and moved to the window. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The fields bathed in a pale, otherworldly light. And there, amidst the tangled remains of the cornfield, he saw it. The Scarecrow was no longer standing where he had left it. It was gone. His stomach twisted, cold fingers of terror creeping up his spine. He scanned the fields, desperately searching for the familiar form, but there was nothing. Only the swaying cornstalks and the long shadows they cast. Yet the dragging noise continued, closer now, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. And then, with a sickening jolt, he saw it. Moving slowly but steadily across the field, the Scarecrow's tattered figure lumbered through the night. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings, but there was no mistaking it. The thing that should not move was alive, and it was coming for him. David stumbled back from the window, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He didn't understand. How could it be? It was just a legend, just a story passed down by superstitious farmers. And yet the creature from that legend was here, moving with purpose through the cursed fields, as if drawn to him, as if it had been waiting all these years for his return. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, twisting and stretching them into grotesque shapes that danced mockingly in the dim light. The wind howled louder, but it wasn't the wind alone. It was the voices again, rising from the depths of the night, calling to him. David. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside him now, clawing at the edges of his sanity, whispering ancient secrets he dared not understand. And then, the front door rattled. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house. David froze, his breath caught in his throat. Who could be out there at this hour? The thought of answering filled him with an icy dread, but the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. He moved slowly, as though in a trance, towards the door, his hand trembling as it reached for the knob. He turned it. The door creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was the Scarecrow. Up close, it was more horrifying than he had imagined. Its burlap skin hung loosely over a skeleton of rotting wood and straw, and the stitched smile on its face was wider now, impossibly wide, stretching from one side of its face to the other in a grotesque parody of joy. But it was the eyes that held David's attention. Two hollow, empty voids, yet somehow brimming with malevolence, as if they could see into the deepest recesses of his soul. It stood motionless, and for a moment, David thought he was dreaming, that the whiskey had finally claimed him. But then it moved, one slow, deliberate step forward. The ground beneath it seemed to groan, as though the earth itself recoiled from the thing's presence. David staggered back, his mind racing for an escape, but there was none. The Scarecrow took another step, its hand, if it could be called a hand, raised, gnarled fingers stretching towards him. And then the whisper came, louder than before, more urgent. David, it's your turn. David's mind teetered on the brink of collapse as he stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat like a drum, signaling the arrival of some unspeakable doom. The Scarecrow, that grotesque parody of life, advanced slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the terror it inspired. Its face, if it could be called a face, twisted into that impossible, stitched grin, the hollow voids where its eyes should have been locked onto him. The air around David felt wrong, too thick, too heavy, as though reality itself was beginning to warp. He could feel it, the pull of something ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the veil of what he understood. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his vision blurring as panic clawed at him. But even in his fear, he could sense the truth. This was no ordinary terror, no mere haunting by a restless spirit. This was older. Darker. The wind outside roared, rattling the old house as though trying to tear it from its foundations. And above it all, those whispers. They were everywhere now. Inside his head, in the walls, in the very bones of the earth. Voices, countless and maddening, chanting his name in a language that was not meant for human tongues. David, it's your turn. Desperate, he turned and fled deeper into the house, his feet pounding against the creaking floorboards. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape, had to get away from that thing, whatever it was. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. In the chaos of his mind, fragments of the legend began to resurface. Half-forgotten tales told by the elders of Ravenshallow, stories whispered in secret by those who dared believe in the supernatural. The Scarecrow was no mere guardian of crops. It was a vessel, a cursed being bound to the land, imbued with the hatred and anguish of a long-dead soul. Each year it rose to claim another victim, and once chosen, there was no escape. David could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him, a suffocating realization that sent icy fingers of dread creeping through his veins. This was no chance encounter. The Scarecrow had been waiting for him. Its victim, marked by forces beyond his comprehension. The room he fled into was his father's bedroom, a space long abandoned and covered in the dust of years gone by. The once familiar room, now foreign and oppressive, seemed to close in on him as he shut the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. But even here, there was no sanctuary. The voices were louder now, their eerie chant resonating through the walls, vibrating the very air. He slumped against the door, trying to catch his breath, his mind racing in circles. He couldn't fight it, he couldn't run. What did the legends say about stopping it? Could anything stop it? His thoughts were interrupted by a low, creaking sound. He froze, his eyes wide with terror. The door behind him, thick, sturdy oak, was bending inward, as though under the weight of something far stronger than any human could manage. The wood groaned in protest, splintering slightly at the edges. And then, the unmistakable sound of scraping, the Scarecrow's fingers dragging across the door. David, open the door. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to block out the sound, the whispers, the terror clawing at his sanity. But there was no escape from it now. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with a palpable sense of doom. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the house had become a living, breathing entity conspiring against him. He stumbled forward, away from the door, his eyes darting around the room in search of anything that could help him. His gaze landed on an old chest in the corner, a relic of his father's, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was locked, the key long since forgotten, but something about it called to him, a faint, irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something inside that could save him. With trembling hands, he grabbed the nearest heavy object, a rusted candlestick, and began to smash it against the lock. Each strike felt like a lifetime, the sound of the door splintering behind him growing louder, more urgent. Finally, with a loud crack, the lock broke, and David threw open the chest. Inside, he found only old books, ancient tomes with faded covers, their pages yellowed with age. His heart sank. It was useless. No weapons, no relics, nothing that could stop the nightmare outside his door. But as he reached for one of the books, something strange happened. The air around him shifted, cold and unnatural, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly. The pages of the book began to flutter on their own, as though stirred by an invisible wind. David stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. And then, from the pages, a strange, otherworldly light began to emanate, a sickly green glow that cast long, twisted shadows across the room. The whispers grew louder, now chanting in a language David couldn't understand, but he felt it. The power behind those words, the darkness they summoned. He stared down at the book, his hands trembling as he realized what it was. His father had been studying the legend. Not just studying, he had been preparing for it. These books were not ordinary. They were filled with rituals, incantations, ancient knowledge that should have remained buried. David's eyes flickered to the door. The Scarecrow was almost through, its grotesque form pressing against the wood, its fingers clawing through the splinters. There was only one way to stop it. With shaking hands, David opened the book and began to read. The passage of time had lost all meaning to David. The nights blended into days, and the days felt like endless stretches of dun, oppressive twilight. He had lost track of when he had last slept. When he tried, his mind was filled with grotesque visions, twisting shadows and the feeling of countless eyes upon him. The Scarecrow's presence was no longer limited to the fields. It had wormed its way into the recesses of his mind. Every corner of the house, every whisper of wind, every shadow cast upon the wall seemed to throb with a malignant pulse. David sat in his father's study, surrounded by the books he had once thought would help him. Instead, they were now an anchor, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He thumbed through ancient tomes of forgotten lore, their brittle pages crumbling beneath his touch. The language in them was archaic, maddeningly cryptic. But there was one passage that stood out, its meaning clawing its way into his thoughts. The harbinger of the harvest shall walk when the veil thins, neither man nor beast, but both. It comes not for flesh, but for the soul. The tether is made when blood is spilled upon the earth, and once chosen, the bond cannot be broken. David's breath caught. Blood, his blood, that day in the fields when he had cut his hand. Had he, without knowing, sealed his own fate? His heartbeat quickened as the realization sank in, his pulse loud in his ears like the beat of some distant, infernal drum. The Scarecrow was not merely hunting him, it had marked him. And the books only hinted at the existence of something far more sinister behind it. The Scarecrow was an avatar, a vessel for something ancient, something that had existed long before this land had ever been tilled. It had come for generations, each time claiming a soul, and in doing so, preserving its own connection to this world. David's mind began to unravel. Could his father have known about this? Could that be why he had devoted his life to studying the legend? A sudden, unbidden memory struck him. His father, late at night, staring blankly at the fields, his face pale and drawn. How had he died? The official cause was a heart attack, but was it something more? Something he had been too afraid to confront? The thought gnawed at David's sanity. He couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the shadows creeping toward him like predators awaiting the final kill. He had to go outside, to confront the thing that stalked him. But as he stepped out onto the porch, the wind howled unnaturally, and the fields stretched out before him like a vast, living entity. The Scarecrow stood in the distance, a silhouette against the dying light, waiting for him. David screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the fields, but it was swallowed by the ever-present wind. The Scarecrow moved now, slow but deliberate, each step a herald of the doom that approached. David scrambled back, his mind torn between fight and flight. But deep down he knew there was no escape. The bond had been forged, and the harvest would be reaped. As the Scarecrow drew closer, David felt an overwhelming presence. A darkness that seemed to stretch beyond time, beyond reality itself. This was no mere ghost story. This was the manifestation of something much older and far more terrifying. The Scarecrow was but a servant of an entity that had watched civilizations rise and fall, an entity that feasted on the souls of those who dared tread upon this cursed land. David's body trembled, his mind shattered under the weight of the revelations. He understood now why his father had been so consumed, why he had died with such fear in his eyes. The Scarecrow had come for him too, and now it had come for David. The ground beneath David's feet began to shift, and he felt a terrible pull. The earth opened like a gaping maw, and within it he saw not soil and roots, but an abyss. A swirling, incomprehensible void that stretched beyond the stars, a gateway to something far worse than death. David's mind reeled, trying to grasp the enormity of what lay before him. But it was too much. His thoughts unraveled, his sanity slipping away as the Scarecrow's hollow eyes gazed down upon him. He had been chosen not for death, but for something far worse. To serve as a vessel, a conduit for the ancient horror that lay beyond the veil. As the Scarecrow raised its skeletal hand, David's body began to sink into the earth. His screams were swallowed by the darkness, and his mind was consumed by the void. And then, silence. The Scarecrow stood once more in the field, motionless, its duty fulfilled for another year. The wind howled, carrying with it the faint whispers of an ancient curse. Somewhere in the distance, another soul would be born, another soul destined to serve the harvest. The cycle would continue, forever